Good afternoon. My name is Ashleigh Lowery from the Division of Medication Error Prevention and Analysis, and after hearing from my colleagues about our work to prevent medication errors, now we'll be talking about our post-market review of medication errors and lessons learned to prevent them. The objectives for this session are to first describe the general principles of medication error reporting and analysis, discuss assessment of reports to determine the type of medication error, root cause, and contributing factors, and also to list examples of post-market medication errors. I'd like to begin by emphasizing that medication errors are a public health burden, and some information to demonstrate that. First is that United States outpatient and inpatient preventable medication errors have an estimated annual cost of nearly $21 billion by one estimate. Another piece of information is that among adult outpatients, 52% of adverse drug reactions were preventable, and 45% of adverse drug reactions were preventable among inpatients, indicating that a preventable drug reaction could be a result of a medication error. I know that you've heard from my colleagues about the DMEPA review activities, and we review proprietary names, non-proprietary name suffixes, product labeling, product packaging, human factors, and product design. And this session will focus on the post-market surveillance aspect of our review. In all of these activities, our reviews take into account current federal regulations, applicable guidance for industry, USP standards, and relevant post-market experience, which means that the post-market experience can inform any of these types of review activities. When we think about medication errors, we think about them across the product life cycle. And what this means is that the post-market experience and lessons learned can inform our pre-market review processes. And also, any risk identified in our pre-market review and approval can guide our post-market surveillance process. Why is post-market surveillance needed? One of those reasons is that the pre-market clinical trials have limitations. Trials are conducted under controlled conditions that may not use the final approved name, labels, labeling, and packaging, which can be significant contributing factors to medication errors. Also, the number of patients tested is too small to detect serious but rare problems, and some errors may fall into this category of being serious but rare. Trials are often also of short duration. While CDER has a robust program to identify potential errors and address them prior to approval, medication errors remain a significant burden on public health. Post-market surveillance allows us to monitor error reports and address those causes of error that may be related to a drug's name, label and labeling, or packaging, ideally before a product is widely distributed. So what are our sources of this post-market information? Primarily patients, consumers, and healthcare professionals, but we can receive this information in two ways. One is FDA MedWatch forms or direct reports from patients, consumers, or healthcare professionals, and the other is manufacturer reports. But both of these types of reports go into FAERS, or the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, which I know you'll be hearing more about tomorrow in detail. But these reports can then be reviewed by a safety evaluator within DMEPA for medication errors. It's also important to keep in mind that medication errors are underreported. While the extent is unknown, the reports received are far below some other estimates of their frequency. In England, they estimate that there are 237 million medication errors occur at some point in the medication process each year. And you may recall that estimate about preventable adverse drug reactions that could be medication errors. However, these numbers are not reflected in the medication errors reported to FAERS. There's no United States requirement to report medication errors to FAERS, which is another reason for underreporting. And underreporting may also be related to other barriers, including organizational culture, lack of reporting forms tailored for medication errors, fear of punishment or liability issues, as well as being unsure where or why to report this type of information. The number of adverse event and medication error cases submitted to FAERS is increasing each year, and DMEPA screens all medication error reports that are submitted to FAERS. For 2019, this was around 136,000 reports. So next, we will talk about how these reports are screened and analyzed. So now we'll move into some of those considerations for post-market medication error surveillance. The assessment of medication errors is generally done by first signal detection, followed by case retrieval, and finally case evaluation. And we'll talk about considerations for medication errors during each of these steps. Beginning with signal detection, the goal in signal detection is to identify and address medication error risks before the product is widely distributed. FDA uses the standard MedDRA query, medication errors, which is a collection of MedDRA terms, as a baseline for screening medication error cases. Another method that we use is early and targeted screenings based on approval date, report type, patient age, for example, pediatric screening, or error type to identify medication errors early. Manual review of case narratives is often needed for signal detection, but we're also exploring the use of predictive analytics and artificial intelligence technologies. When determining if a report is a medication error, recall the definition of a medication error from the last session, which is a preventable event that may cause or lead to inappropriate medication use or patient harm while the medication is in control of the healthcare professional, patient, or consumer. In addition to the definition, there are other considerations when identifying a medication error. One is that a preventable event refers to events that are due to errors that could be avoided. For example, a patient who receives a wrong drug because of lookalike container labels is a preventable event. On the other hand, a patient with no history of allergies who experiences anaphylaxis after taking a sulfa drug for the first time is not considered a preventable error. Events that happen during the manufacturing process aren't medication errors, but can potentially result in medication errors. For example, a device malfunction can result in a dose omission error. Also within the definition, intentional or deliberate use, such as abuse, misuse, or off-label use of a drug product in a manner inconsistent with the FDA required labeling, generally isn't considered a medication error. Medication error may or may not result in an adverse event. If you do identify a suspected medication error, other considerations are: one, what is the type of error? Second, where did the error originate? For example, was it a prescribing error or a dispensing error? And what are the contributing factors? For example, lookalike names or label confusion. And lastly, identifying if the case involves potential for error, which sometimes can be described as a complaint, a near miss, or an actual error that reached a patient. Once a medication error is identified, it can be categorized into a medication error type. Medication error type can be described using the NCC MERP taxonomy, which is a standard language to classify and collect data on medication errors. You can see the examples listed here, and this can be used, or medication errors can be categorized differently to suit a specific issue or case type. I'd like to present an example and go over some questions. This article appeared in a newsletter of the Institute for Safe Medication Practices and described that ISMP had received 8 reports this year about potential for mix-ups between Prolia and Udenyca, which are pictured on the right. So the first question is this a medication error? So I'll give you a few moments to think about your response. And the answer is yes, that this would classify as a medication error. Potential for medication error is within the definition by something that may cause or lead to inappropriate medication use. Although these reports were potential for mix-ups, these are still classified as medication errors. Next, what is the type of medication error? So I'll pause again for you to think about what your response may be. And the answer in this case is wrong drug, is the potential for a mix-up, a patient receiving Prolia in place of Eudenica or receiving Eudenica in place of Prolia. And the last question is, what are potential contributing factors that you can identify for these wrong drug medication errors? So I'll pause once more. So some of the contributing factors you may be thinking of are the use of the same color. Both cartons use a very similar or identical green coloring. The design of the cartons has some similarities. For example, the green circle surrounding the strength presentation. What may not be visible on the size of the image, but another potential contributing factor is the overlap in dose. Eudenica is a 6 milligram syringe, and Prolia is 60 milligrams per milliliter. So using the same number by a factor of 10. Another contributing factor could be the setting of use. These were identified in outpatient infusion sites or the storage setting, such as an automated dispensing cabinet. And we'll come back to this example later to talk about potential mitigations. So once you've identified a medication error signal, you can then retrieve cases to more fully assess it. As with signal detection, review of narratives is often needed, but some of the other considerations are expanding the search terms beyond the standard MEDDRA query for medication errors. Product quality, device, or adverse event search terms could be added, and narrative text searches are another method that could be used if there's a specific term or medication error type that may be entered in the narrative that can be searched for. And then manual review can often be needed to review the full narrative for a full assessment. I've mentioned that manual narrative review is needed, and one of those reasons is that the reporting forms lack structured fields to capture things such as the error type, contributing factors, or other medication error information needed for assessment. Thus, the information during case retrieval is identified from the narrative since it doesn't have a specific structured field. And this is an example of the MedWatch form. Another one of the challenges in case retrieval is the coding of the cases. Coding is often not specific enough, but a narrative can provide additional details. This is an example of a narrative and its submitted MEDDRA code. While I won't read through the entire case, it's obvious that there's a good bit of information submitted. And if you had the time to read, you would see that it reports some various adverse events, including altered mental status, lethargy, renal tubular acidosis, and the patient was found to have used a clonidine patch to attach an NG tube dressing, thinking that it was a standard adhesive patch. The coding, however, was simply medication error, which could refer to a number of different events, but more specific terms would facilitate retrieving any similar cases during case retrieval. And other examples of some of these coding challenges are that it can be inconsistent with the case narrative or nonspecific. And you'll be hearing more about MEDDRA tomorrow as well. But one example scenario was a patient at an infusion center who received drug A instead of prescribed drug B. The submitted code was wrong patient received medication, but a recommended, more specific code would be to use wrong drug administered. The second example is a patient who experienced difficulty pressing down on a plunger. It was hard to push down and could not push down all the way. So the submitted code was accidental underdose, but as the narrative refers to the device, a recommended MEDDRA code would be device difficult to use. And the third example describes a patient who died after receiving vecuronium instead of the intended midazolam, and the submitted MEDDRA code was incorrect dosage administered, which is inconsistent with that case description, and the correct code would be wrong drug administered. So after retrieving cases, it's important to assess for details and determine if action is warranted. So during evaluation of cases, we'll have created a case series and perform a risk assessment. Some things that we'll take into consideration during this evaluation is, one, the challenge that incomplete reports can be difficult to interpret. For example, something describing pen jammed is not necessarily clear if it's a malfunction or a usability or use error. We'll also consider any described root causes or contributing factors to the case, the stage in the medication use system where the error originated, the setting of use, any reporter recommendations to prevent the error, associated adverse events and outcomes. After reviewing these cases, we'll review the labeling, packaging, design, and name, if applicable, to the particular type of error, and determine if regulatory action is warranted. So moving on to consider these potential post-market actions. So potential post-market actions to mitigate medication errors can include proprietary name changes, revising product labels and labeling, product packaging changes, product design revisions, or issuing safety communications. So if you recall the example from earlier in the presentation with the overlapping green color, this example was mitigated with a labeling color change. So you can see on the right in the images that UDENYCA is revised to use a yellow coloring on the carton compared to the previous green color, which better differentiates it from Prolia. This is another example that led to a proprietary name change. So in July 2011, Brilinta or ticagrelor was approved, and in September 2013, Brintellix, vortioxetine, was approved. FDA began receiving medication error reports of name confusion between these two products, and in July 2015 issued a drug safety communication alerting to this risk. However, after the safety communication, we continued to receive additional cases, and in May 2016, this risk was mitigated by the name Brintellix changing to Trintellix. So thinking back to some of those case assessment steps, when you think about the error type in this case, the concern is wrong drug, and contributing factors are the first three letters overlapping of these two names, which can increase their similarity and also contribute to potential CPOE confusion when they're next to each other in a pick list. And another contributing factor in this case is their recent approvals. So neither name was had a lot of familiarity in the market. This is an example of a container label revision. So you can see on the left two products, hydralazine and hydroxyzine, both 25 milligrams. So some contributing factors to a potential wrong drug error in this case could include that they have the same strength of 25 milligrams, look alike and sound alike established names, and use the same green color. So on the right are revised labels for hydroxyzine, where you can see that the tall man letters in the middle of the established name were highlighted for further emphasis, and the color was also revised from green to blue to better differentiate from the 25 milligram hydralazine product. This is an example of a packaging design change as a result of medication errors. So medication errors were reported regarding Benadryl itch stopping gel being administered orally instead of topically. So you can see on the image on the left the original container closure, and the contributing factors to this error included, one, the container closure that does resemble an oral product, and patients' familiarity with Benadryl as an oral product that is available on the market. In addition, the product has a low viscosity that does not lead someone to immediately believe that it should be applied topically. These errors resulted in serious adverse reactions and some requiring hospitalization. So in this case, the mitigation was a packaging design change to the tube that you see on the right, which is a more familiar topical configuration in terms of the type of container closure, and increased the prominence of the warning that you can see for skin use only. This is an example of medication errors that resulted in communication, but not necessarily a labeling change. So Entresto was approved in 2015 and is contraindicated with the use of ACE inhibitors. However, FDA received multiple cases of concomitant use with adverse events reported that included angioedema, hyperkalemia, acute kidney injury, and hypotension. So to communicate this information about the contraindication and required washout period, we published an FDA advisor in the Institute for Safe Medication Practices newsletter to better reach prescribers, nurses, and pharmacists in the community. So you may recall this graphic from earlier in the presentation, and I'd like to re-emphasize that the lessons learned from these post-market cases can inform our pre-market review process. For example, in the case of the Benadryl product, we would ensure that our pre-market reviews assess the implied route of administration of a package type and make recommendations prior to approval. But we are constantly improving both our pre-market review processes and our post-market surveillance of medication errors. So in summary, medication errors are a public health burden, and post-market surveillance can identify medication error reports and address causes related to a drug's name, label or labeling, or packaging. And when reviewing cases, consider the type of error, contributing factors, and potential mitigations. Our post-market experience also can then inform our pre-market review activities on how to prevent errors. And I've included some resources relating to our review activities, and I can take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ashleigh, for that fantastic presentation and overview. So we have many questions, and if the audience would like to type their questions in the chat pod in the lower right, we will hopefully get to your specific question. But we have some that were submitted during the presentation, so we'll get right to it. Our first question is about when sponsors submit medication errors that do not involve a patient, for example, a near miss or a stalking error, are these reports considered valid cases even though there's no identifiable patient? All right.
Okay. This is Ashleigh. Thank you for that question. And the answer to that would be yes, that a near miss would be still considered a valid case, and we take those into consideration. We've had examples in the past where there's occasions where a near miss is often reported before an error that actually does reach the patient. So even though a near miss doesn't involve a patient, it still has the potential to involve one later, and we'd be given the same consideration as an error that did reach a patient.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question is about medication errors. Are all of the medication errors supposed to be reported, and do they follow a standard 15 and 7-day reporting requirement?
Okay, thank you. Reporting of medication errors is voluntary unless it is associated with an adverse event. So if it is a medication error that resulted in an adverse event, then it would follow the same regulation in terms of 15-day reports for serious and unexpected adverse events. So the answer is yes, that it would follow that in the cases that it results in an adverse event.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question is about if there's a situation where two products that are creating post-market medication errors, how would you determine which sponsor needs to change their product and which label or carton gets changed?
That's a great question. So a couple things that might be of consideration if there's two products that are being confused with each other and need some differentiation. There are cases where it's two products from the same sponsor, in which case they can determine how they may differentiate those two products or two strengths of a single product. But when it's two different products and dealing with two different companies, the change is requested of the most recently approved product.
Great, thank you. And we have another question about patients, actually. And is it possible for patients to report medication errors?
Thank you for that question. And yes, the MedWatch form and reporting is available to the public. So a patient, healthcare provider, consumer, anyone can report through a MedWatch form. It accounts for a small percentage of the reports that we receive. The majority, about 95%, do come from manufacturer reports, but the MedWatch form is available.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have another question for you. Would DMEPA recommend sponsors include packaging configuration in a risk assessment with comparators or other sponsor medications?
If I understand the question correctly, asking if they include the packaging configuration and compare to other sponsors' packaging configurations in terms of risk for confusion, which isn't a standard part of our review process, but we would consider risk and confusion with other products when we do receive cases.
Great. Okay, we're just looking through the different questions. What strategy would you recommend in determining the impact of a specific intervention to reduce medication errors in the general population? Or maybe that's just a little bit too broad.
Yeah. Sure. So, and I think part of the presentation alludes to why it can be sometimes difficult to quantify specific interventions' impact because of medication error reporting being underreported. But we will monitor in our surveillance processes for additional or continued errors or reduction in errors after a change is made.
Great, thank you. And I think that's all of the questions we have right now. So what we'll do, thank you so much for your presentation and again for taking all of these questions, fantastic answers. And we're going to go ahead and move on to a 15-minute break. And we will see everyone in 15 minutes for our next presentation. Thank you.